Good afternoon. Welcome to this policy dialogue on sanctions, which is part of a new project we're launching at the EPC to look into the role of sanctions in this new geopolitical era. It's clear that we live in a very different world, that we have seen major changes over the last years, whether we call it the perma crisis as we have done, whether we call it watersheds, but clearly we're living in a world where geopolitics and geoeconomics is very much in flux. We have had the latest, or we are going to have in a few days, the latest instance of that global change with the inauguration of Trump, the repeat inauguration of Trump, which will also have an impact, we believe, on the rise of economic statecraft, the use of trade as an instrument of politics. But clearly, we're not only talking about the US, we're talking about a changing global landscape where China, Russia, and many others are now playing a bigger role. We are moving from the world we were used to with a more or less functioning global rules-based order to one which is much more conflictual, much more contested. And sanctions will have to play a role in this as well. But clearly, there's a lot still to be discussed, especially in the EU. We need to find a sanctions policy which fits with this new era. Do we need more assertive use of sanctions in future? What do we do if our allies are using them? What about cooperating or opposing the use of sanctions? But I think there are very basic questions we still haven't answered within the EU about under what circumstances are sanctions actually effective? What are the requirements we need to make them work? Where do they fit into the wider economic security strategy? And what kind of capacities do we need to build within the European Union in the coming years? Now, we've had a very much real-time experiment in building up our sanctions capacity when it comes to the many sanctions packages we've had in relation to Russia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we are very honored to have David O'Sullivan again to talk to us about how sanctions have been applied and what the first-hand experience is, given he's been very much involved as the EU sanctions envoy. So very much looking forward to the discussion. We will start with a few remarks from David, and then Svitlana Taran will moderate a discussion, and she will introduce the speakers for the panel, which David will also join. So thank you very much all for being here. Looking very much forward to working together on this new project. And David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Fabian. I do indeed have a certain sense of déjà vu. I think I've been here a few times talking about sanctions. I'll try not to repeat myself too much, but inevitably there's a certain amount of common ground. And I do understand that this is in the context of a broader context of looking at economic security, the changing tectonic plate shifting of the geopolitical world in which we live. And I think that's what we'll be discussing on the panel. I'll be happy to contribute to that. I mean, I think I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I'm a bit of a sanctions skeptic. I actually don't think that sanctions are the answer to every problem. I think they have their place and a very important place. But I believe they need to be used in some moderation. And too often, I fear they are used because we can't think of anything else to do. And, you know, that's also understandable, because I've been in situations where politicians have faced difficult moments and have said, we have to do something. The advice you'd love to give is, actually, we don't need to do anything. And then this is never welcome advice. And so in the end, something has to be done, and sanctions are frequently the answer. And they are frequently, they can be something useful, but they also have their limits. And I think we need to be very aware of that. Now, in the case of Russia, I think the need for sanctions is absolutely clear-cut. I mean, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia is in itself a tectonic plate-shifting event. It is the first time we have seen great power warfare used extensively in Europe since the Second World War. We've had other conflicts, we've had moments of tension, but we've never had a return to an attempt by a great power to use military force to subdue and to occupy a neighbor. This is a shocking event. I still can't fully believe that we are in this situation. I sometimes have to pinch myself and say, are we really in the 21st century? This is what we're doing. This is what's happening on a daily basis. The destruction, the death of civilians, but also of soldiers. The fact that even as we're talking and we're debating here this thing, there's a war going on. People are dying. The kidnapping of the children and so forth. I mean, there are other horrible wars, don't get me wrong. This is not a uniquely horrible war. It's just uniquely shocking that in Europe of the 21st century, we're having such an event, because we really thought we had found ways of not needing to have recourse to this ever again. And those fail-safe mechanisms have clearly not worked, and we have to draw some conclusions. So it's absolutely clear that we are witnessing a civilizational struggle over who defines the rules of engagement in Europe in the 21st century. Is it the rule of law and the respect of sovereignty and negotiated solutions, or is it the rule of the might is right and military force? And that is why we cannot allow the might is right or military force argument to prevail, because it would be a catastrophe. And we know what catastrophes that has bred in Europe in the past. So sanctions were an inevitable part of our response, and they have been a very important part of our response. Not the only part. There's military assistance, there's macroeconomic assistance, humanitarian assistance, political assistance. We have offered the people of Ukraine some greater perspective, clearer perspective on what their future might look like through membership of the EU or other political options. But sanctions were also a very important part. And the objective of the sanctions, and I think it's always important to go back to basics when you talk about sanctions, to say, what are the sanctions trying to achieve? What is the purpose? And I think we had three main objectives. One was obviously to deny Russia the technology needed to make sophisticated weaponry. The second was to deny Russia the revenue to continue to finance and to nurture this war. And the third was to degrade the industrial capacity of Russia in order to make it more increasingly difficult to sustain a war economy over time. I believe that we have had an enormous impact across all these three objectives. Of course, it's not perfect. Sanctions are by definition leaky, and they are not always as impactful as you may immediately hope they will be. But over time, they do progressively grind down and have their impact. And if we look at the situation in Russia, I think it's very important to explain more clearly publicly than is sometimes the case in Europe, that our sanctions, and they're not just European sanctions, they are taken with the G7 and a wider sanctioning coalition, have had an enormous impact on the Russian economy. We estimate that Russia has about 400 billion euros less of liquidity than they would otherwise have had if we didn't have the sanctions. That's in part due to the immobilized assets of the central bank, but also to other measures. And if we look at the Russian economy today, it is clear that we are now looking at a dual economy. There is the war economy, which is functioning reasonably well. If you think a war economy is productive, it's producing weaponry, it's producing equipment, and it's being destroyed on the battlefields in Ukraine, after having also, unfortunately, destroyed other people and things with it. But it's not a productive exercise. It is ultimately money down a drain. You look at the real economy, the productive economy, and you see that this is suffering very, very greatly. There is 21% interest rate, 10% inflation, somewhere around there. Not even sure if that's the official figure. Frankly, there's anecdotal evidence that the inflation rate is much higher in Russia. And in any event, those two figures of that high an inflation rate and that high an interest rate would be stifling for any economy. I was interviewed by a French journalist recently who said, Mr. Sullivan, you talk about the sanctions, but Russia has a growth rate of 4%. We'd love to have 4% growth rate in France. And I said, yeah, and you want the 21% interest rate and the 10% inflation rate that goes with it? And he said, well, yes, no, of course not that, but the 4% we'll take. Well, yes, if you want to turn your economy into a war economy, you can have that, but I'm not sure it's in the best interests of your citizens. Unemployment is also very, very low. The labor market is heavily squeezed through both the mobilization and the fact that many people are being forced into military service and also dying in the battlefields, and the fact that some of the best and the brightest and the most talented Russian people have left and are unlikely ever to return. You find them in the cafes and the bars of Astana and Tbilisi and elsewhere, making a new future for themselves in other countries. So Mr. Putin is basically cannibalizing the productive economy in order to keep alive the war economy. This is possible for a certain amount of time, but at a certain moment, this becomes unsustainable. The fact that the time under which it will become unsustainable doesn't fit perfectly with our objectives of stopping the war sooner. Is just a reality we have to accept. That's the limit of sanctions. You have to use other means to achieve that objective. Now, in terms of the circumvention of sanctions and the broader international impact of the sanctions, we have to acknowledge that the great weakness of our sanctions is that they are not UN mandated. We have always believed in multilateralism. We have always tried to work through the UN for our sanctions, whether this is the DPRK or the Iran sanctions when we were trying to get Iran to the table over the nuclear program. Obviously, the fact that we were unable to get UN, notwithstanding having 140 votes in the UN General Assembly condemning the Russian action, we needed a vote in the Security Council, and we're not going to get that when a permanent member of the Security Council is in flagrant breach of the UN Charter. This is unfortunately a dilemma for the United Nations that we have to work on for the future at some point, but it does explain why we have had to have recourse to autonomous measures, which we don't like, and which we would sometimes be critical of if others did it. But I think under the circumstances, we had absolutely no choice. But this is one of the biggest problems we have in encouraging other countries to join with us. And we have to acknowledge that there is a certain amount of leakage of our sanctions through countries who are not applying our sanctions. I spent a lot of my time traveling to these countries, whether this is in Central Asia, the Caucasus, Turkey, Serbia, UAE, increasingly this year, or last year, I should say, Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, where we see that there is always the possibility of deflection of our sanctions and the possibility for Russia to continue to procure certain of the most dangerous products, particularly those pertaining to the battlefield, by using circumvention. We have to be very clear-eyed about this. One of the first features of sanctions is circumvention. As day follows night, if you have sanctions, there's going to be circumvention. Firstly, because the country affected is going to seek to circumvent, but also because there's money to be made. Let's be very blunt. It's like the war on drugs or the war on criminality. There is a financial incentive to be had if you evade sanctions, and people are always going to take that risk. What I constantly repeat is that our objective is not to eliminate circumvention. it is constantly to make it harder, to make it more complicated and therefore slower, and to make it more expensive. And I believe this is what we have succeeded in doing. Every time we eliminate possibilities of circumvention, Russia is required to find new channels of circumvention. This makes it slower. It makes the supply chain less predictable, and it ultimately makes it the end product more expensive, because you have to pay new middle people their take of the cost of circumvention. And we see evidence that, for example, for the battlefield products, Russia is paying now perhaps higher as much as 100 or 130% more for these products than when it was purchasing them on the open market prior to sanctions. It's not to say that they are no longer able to get these products. Unfortunately, they still are, but it's much more difficult, much slower, and much more expensive. The same is true of the oil price cap and the revenue side, where in 2022 we managed to, in 2023 we managed to bring down the revenue by about 30%. But here again, we have to acknowledge that we built into our sanctions something which is a constraint, which was we did not wish to destabilize the international oil markets. And we did not want to have a full embargo on Russia's export of hydrocarbons, because we did not want to deprive the global south of access to this product, which we know was very important for many of them. And we didn't want to be accused, which we were in the beginning, of undermining their economies through our sanctions. So we've always had to accept that there would be continued export of Russian hydrocarbon. We ourselves have largely weaned ourselves off, and that we've stopped taking in oil. We've cut our gas dramatically from 45% down to 15%. We've had a little help from the Ukrainians, a further drop in gas over the new year. And we are continuing to help all those member states who have some continued dependence on Russian energy to eliminate that from their energy mix. And that will be our objective. But we cannot, and we are not trying to fully ban the export of Russian oil, for example, to the rest of the world. What we have done is to put in place the price cap. In other words, to put a discount on that so that the Russian revenue is affected. And this was very successful in 23, a bit less successful in 24, though still we see around a 20% cut in revenue. But there we had the growth of the shadow fleet. And this is an important area of action where we are now sanctioning the vessels of the fleet. And we're also looking, you look at what the recent initiative of the Nordic and Baltic countries to explore, looking at the insurance of these very dangerous vessels passing through their waters. There's clearly an international maritime organization, a maritime safety issue here, which has to be addressed. And I believe that we will increasingly make it difficult for Russia to evade the price cap through the use of the shadow fleet. So this is where we stand. I think it's very important that the actual implementation of sanctions is the key to the success. And this is a fairly boring subject, because to be very honest with you, people love announcing new sanctions, right? But the actual grind of making these sanctions work and having the impact is a fairly tedious exercise, and it's a very monotonous exercise. And we have to bear in mind that every day in Moscow and St. Petersburg and probably other parts of Russia, there are people who come into the office with only one objective, namely to circumvent our sanctions. And all of us involved in sanctions policy in the EU, and particularly in the member states, because the implementation of the sanctions is for member states, need to come into the office with the same degree of commitment and enthusiasm to do the opposite, to make sure that we fight against the circumvention of our sanctions and that we maximize the impact of our sanctions. And that is something which I have to say member states have increasingly taken very seriously. Perhaps not in the beginning, because in many cases they saw sanctions as some kind of foreign policy instrument which, was somehow implemented out there. And then they began to realize that these sanctions, and the Russia sanctions cover 60% of all our previous trade with Russia, imports and exports, reach deeply into the fabric of our economic and commercial life. And the implementation and the effective implementation required us to engage the customs authorities, the ministries of industry, ministries of finance, prosecutors, in police, investigative, the criminal justice system. And it took a little while for member states fully to wake up to the fact that they needed, in many cases, completely to re-engineer how they went about implementing sanctions. And this is now, I think, happening, and very definitely happening. And we are seeing increasingly professionalization of the implementation of sanctions. And I think that's a very welcome thing. We will talk later about how many lessons you can learn from the Russian experience for other situations. I sincerely hope that we would never again need to have the scale of sanctions against anyone. I don't think it is a good thing. It's the sign of an unhealthy situation in which we find ourselves, deeply unhealthy first and foremost for the Ukrainians. Let's never forget what they are suffering. But it's not a positive element. I don't think sanctions are something which are constructive. They are something that you do to inflict pain and inconvenience on somebody who is trying to do harm either to you or to an ally. And I hope that we would never find ourselves, or we are unlikely to find ourselves, sanctioning anyone again on this scale. Having said that, there are certainly things we can learn. One thing I think we can learn is that having the implementation of sanctions spread amongst 27 member states can lead to some inconsistencies, can lead to some contradictions even in the way member states apply it. So we need to work on a level playing field. We need to do more to harmonize the way in which sanctions are implemented and interpreted. This is an exercise for member states to talk amongst themselves, because there's a lot of, sometimes the issues are just purely how one country experiences the interpretation by another of the sanctions. I think at some point, maybe in the future, we need to look at maybe having a one-stop European shop for managing particularly the derogations, the exemptions, the general licenses, and so forth, not to manage the whole spectrum of sanctions. I wouldn't suggest trying to manage all that out of Brussels. It would be an impossible task. But I think having a one-stop European shop for managing the derogations, the exemptions, the licenses would, I think, greatly facilitate the life both of member states and particularly of our industry, and particularly those companies who work across many jurisdictions within the EU. They frequently have to apply to several authorities for permissions, don't always get the same answer, or certainly don't always get the answer in the same time frame. So that's something that I've heard from industry we really need to look at. But as I say, let's have the discussion now about sanctions more generally. They are an important and useful instrument of policy, but I repeat, they are to be used, in my view, with great moderation and with very clear ideas about what you're trying to achieve and why you are choosing to use this rather than other policy instruments, which are also there and which are mentioned in some of the papers I've read from the EPC. So I will stop there. Sorry, I've probably spoken for a bit longer than I should have. Once you get me started on this subject, it's hard to stop, but I look forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Very much, Ambassador Sullivan. And dear guest, we are now open Q&A for Ambassador. You can ask your questions. Please, maybe a bit later. Please prepare your questions now. Please introduce yourself and be concise and short if possible, so we can take more questions. We have about 10-15 minutes for questions, and then we will start our panel discussion. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't read the script.
Thank you very much. Nicholas Weiss from APCO, but speaking in a purely personal capacity. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for the broad geopolitical picture of sanctions and their desirability or not. I hate to drill down to the specific, but I'm going to drill down to the specific. What do you think are the prospects for imposing more vigorous sanctions in the agricultural sector in the current the current problems with Russia? Because I understand that at present that's been kind of put aside because of concerns about global supply chain issues. Are those concerns still valid? Is there room for further for stronger sanctions in that sector?
Well, I think we need to, as you say, there has been a very great concern on the part of the G7 and all the partners, not unduly to disrupt the supply chains of the global South. And we went through a kind of bumpy period in the very beginning where there was a lot of those accusations being thrown around. It's true that maybe in the immediate aftermath of the sanctions, there were some spikes of prices, but very quickly they returned to normal. And I think we don't hear that at all now, and haven't heard it for quite some time. I think we need to distinguish between what we as Europeans consume in terms of agricultural products versus what we might want to see, or whether it's fertilizer or agricultural products or other things. I think we maybe need to look at our dependence and our continued financing of Russian revenue through purchases of this kind versus the issue of trying to affect the supply to global South, and particularly the poorer countries, where I really don't. I think it would be very counterproductive if we sought to make it very difficult for them to access these products.
Thank you very much, Laura Dubois from the Financial Times. Thank you for your speech. I was wondering what you think the impact of Donald Trump's inauguration on Monday will be. I guess we're all kind of curious about his speech. Hungary has already said that they will wait for the rollover of the sanctions that we already have until they heard Trump speak. Are you worried that there's going to be a rollback of the Russia sanctions that we already have?
Well, I think, first of all, from a European perspective, we just need to continue on our own trajectory. We have our own policy objectives. It's very important that we continue with the existing sanctions, and it's very important that we adopt an ambitious 16th package, which will be brought forward by the Commission at the end of this month. And I know the Polish presidency is very keen to have it adopted before the tragic third anniversary of the war in February. I noticed that all the other coalition partners have also brought out new sanctions. The Americans brought out 2 waves of new sanctions, the Japanese and others, the UK as well. So I think for the moment, the trajectory is to continue to intensify the pressure on Russia through sanctions. We know there's a change of administration. You're not going to draw me into any kind of quotation about what we can expect. There will be changes of policy. We know that. But the one thing I would say is that I think America's fundamental security interests have not changed, notwithstanding the election. And I don't see that involves Mr. Putin to be seen to having a win in this situation in Ukraine. I just don't see how you see that from America, that's a bipartisan position, I think, in the United States. And so I think it'll be against that backdrop that we will see what the new administration seeks to achieve. But we as Europeans have our own clear objectives and interests, and I think we have to continue on the trajectory on which we are launched.
Christopherson, retiree. One question about oil sanctions. Of course, it's true that one of the reasons why we could not implement a full oil embargo was because of the developing countries. But of course, there were also, in particular from the US, a wish to see that oil prices did not rise too much around the world in general. I don't think we have seen in a sanction context anything like a capping system. Now, in the 12th hour, Biden, as you said just a moment ago, has introduced further sanctions on the shadow fleets. Can we expect further sanctions from the EU side, which in one way or the other copy what Biden has been doing now for the 16th package?
Well, what the Americans have announced is in the line of what we've already been trying to do. I mean, I want to be very clear. We have, on the one hand, never tried to say that we would stop the export of Russian oil in particular, as we did, say, for example, with Iran. There were three reasons for that, as you rightly say. You've cited two of them. I would cite a third, which is we don't have the power to do it, frankly. I mean, it would be, I remember very well outreach to third countries over the Iran sanctions, where we had a UN mandate, but some of them were a bit slow to kind of follow the UN, and we had to push them a bit to say, this is how we get Iran to the table in order to avoid them acquiring military nuclear capabilities. And finally, everyone did, and it had a huge impact, and the Iranians indeed came to the table, and we had I think, a very fine actual diplomatic agreement in the JCPOA, which unfortunately Mr. Trump didn't see fit to allow to continue. So that's why we didn't go for an embargo. So it is we have never said that it's wrong for Russian oil to be traded. And by the way, we never said that European carriers could not carry that oil. What we said is they have to respect the price cap, which was aimed at targeting the revenue, so which was $60 a barrel. You can argue, like any economist, whether that's the right level, and some people are talking now about a lower level, but one way or another, it is a price cap which is somewhat below the international price of oil and which undermines Russia's source of revenue. And that's what we're continuing to do, and that's why we set the price cap. The shadow fleet is a way of evading the price cap, because clearly Russia is trading that oil at prices higher than the price cap. And that is why we have to put an end to the shadow fleet, which also poses a massive ecological risk, because these are end-of-life vessels, frequently in very bad condition, crewed under conditions that we're not entirely sure how qualified the crews are, and most importantly, with insurance, the value of which is very uncertain. So we have to address this from all the angles, both the sanctioning of the vessels. We have to reach out to the flag states who have certain responsibilities for flagging vessels which may not be properly maintained, or which may not be properly crewed, or which may not be properly insured. We have to look at the International Maritime Organization, and we have to look at what legitimately under international maritime law our littoral states can do to protect themselves from the risk of a massive oil spill for which there would be no money. So it's that totality of measures that we're all looking at. What the Americans have announced is in that line. We will certainly continue those kind of measures in the 16 package.
Amanda Paul from the EPC. It's very nice to see you here again, David. You were talking about Iran, so I'd like to continue along those lines, because 2 days ago, I think 2 or 3 days ago, there was a meeting of the E3 in Geneva with the Iranians. I think it's the second time in the last few months. Iran clearly wants to get sanction relief. They're also very worried about the Trump administration's return to office, given what happened the last time, and probably their weakening situation in the Middle East as well. So I'm just wondering, does this represent an opportunity to try and break apart Iran's relationship with Russia? I mean, I know that Iran and Russia recently signed a new strategic partnership, but could this issue of sanctions and the incoming Trump be used as leverage as a way to change this dynamic in that relationship and to draw Iran away from the Russians? Thank you.
Well, look, I mean, I'm fortunately, my responsibility is for Russian sanctions and not for the rest of the world. So, but what I will say is this. I think the acquisition by Iran of nuclear weapons would be a disaster for the Middle East and for the problems which that region already knows a great deal of. So I would never give up hope that we can use the sanctions against Iran as part of a diplomatic discussion of the kind we had with the JCPOA to try to definitively rule out the possibility that Iran could acquire nuclear weapons and to find ways of building a new relationship with Iran. one of the criticisms of the JCPOA is it didn't address the totality of issues we had. It didn't address the issue of ballistic missile. It didn't address the issue of funding of terrorism or unfriendly behavior in the region. Maybe now we need to have a more complete discussion, though I would point out that at the time, it was actually the powers negotiating with Iran who deliberately chose not to have a global negotiation. The Iranians actually proposed a global negotiation, and we decided we wanted to focus on the nuclear issue because we didn't want to have trade-offs between the other issues and the nuclear. We wanted to nail down the best possible deal on the nuclear, which would put the possibility of nuclear weapons utterly beyond Iran's reach, which I believe the JCPOA did achieve. But maybe, I mean, I'm no longer close to these discussions, so I don't want to comment, but I have not given up hope that we can find a way forward with Iran, which precludes the possibility of the acquisition of military weapons and which, by corollary, would lead to some sanctions relief and to hopefully some thawing of the relationship. And if that means that Iran is less dependent on Russia, then that would be a good thing.
And we also have one question from our online audience, very practical question. So are there any plans to sanction Russia's fertilizers?
I think we are always examining all the issues. There were no such sanctions in the early stages. I think I mentioned in relation to agriculture products. I think all of the things which we continue to import from Russia in one way or another are open for discussion as to whether we want to continue those imports or whether we believe we should shut those imports off. So I think nothing is ruled out in these discussions, but I really don't want to prejudge what could be the presentation of the 16th or future packages.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we will close now Q&A session, and please, dear speakers, take your seats. We will start our discussion. Thank you. So first of all, I would like to introduce our distinguished speakers today. And I would like to say thank you very much for Ambassador Sullivan for staying with us also for this panel discussion. And we are also happy to have with us today Ambassador Nerijus Aleksiejūnas, who is a permanent representative of Lithuania to the EU. Thank you for coming, dear Ambassador. We have also in person next to me our EPC senior policy expert, Philipp Lausberg. He's also a lead of our sanction project. And we have two online speakers today, who is Sylvie Matelly, director of the Jacques Delors Institute. Thank you for joining us online, Sylvie. And Nataliia Shapoval she's a vice president for policy research from Kyiv School of Economics. Nataliia will be with us from Kyiv. Thank you for joining us, Nataliia. And I will start our panel with a round of questions to our speakers. Please make your takes for about 6-7 minutes. and after that, we will have the second Q&A session. And you, for our online audience, please prepare your questions already during the discussion. And for our in-person audience, please prepare your question for after the discussion. And also, dear speakers, you will have the possibility after my first questions to also to comment or react to the comments from your fellow speakers. And I would like to start our discussion with you, dear Ambassador Aleksiejūnas. Sorry if I pronounce it wrongly. As Fabian already mentioned, we can observe that we are living in the very confrontational and a very increasingly multipolar world. And in this world, unfortunately, the economic power of Europe and of the European Union is declining, and as well as so-called Brussels effect, Brussels diplomacy effect. And we also can see that the coherence of the West is also increasingly questioned, especially under Trump II administration. And we, in response to this, we can see the escalating rise in the use of economic statecraft, including all this tariff issue, including export controls and sanctions. And to quote our colleague Georg Riekels, we are moving from the free trade world to sanction-based world, whether we like it or not, unfortunately. And in this, so my question is to you, is the European Union is well equipped to this new geopolitical context? How should the EU sanctions change in order to better fit to this context? Should the EU use sanctions in a more proactive, not only reactive way, as it used to be earlier, like relying only on defensive instruments or diplomatic efforts, but also more proactively, and to pursue its own goals and values. And we can see that Russia, China, and the US also used sanctions quite offensively, I would say, to pursue their national and economic security interests. And Lithuania, your country, has been exposed actually to this pressure, to this behavior by China, for example. And so from your experience, should the EU to be bolder, I would say, and sound in the use of sanctions and export controls? Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank you inviting me to come to the panel, because for me as newly arrived ambassador, I think it's good to start with EPC and on a subject which is very close to our hearts, because on sanctions, I think we witnessed many different kind of experience. And as I know David for already many years, I think that I would start with what David rightly said, that if we talk about sanctions, we need to be clear about our objectives. What exactly we would like to achieve with this tool, what we as the European Union has, and then it will be much more clear how we need to do that. So starting maybe with that maybe just to remind all of us that sanctions against Russia didn't start in 2022. I remember myself, I was in Brussels at that time in 2014, when the first sanctions against Russia were introduced on the basis of Crimea annexation and situation in Donbas region. And I think at that period of time, the main reflex of the Union was that maybe with the sanctions we will change behavior of Putin. So in this sense, I think that this objective was not achieved. We witnessed very concrete results happening later. I mean, the start of the war in Ukraine. So I think we need to be clear exactly what we want to achieve, because sanctions that we introduced in 2014 were not so impressive. Putin was not impressed by them. I know whether we were so honest about these sanctions, about the implementation of these sanctions, and in a way, this objective was not clearly met. I fully agree with David that. Now, looking in today's perspective, sanctions is the main objective is to stop Russian war economy, and in this way to help Ukraine to win the war. I think that's one of the clear element what we want to achieve. But in order to do that, I think three important elements are: firstly, how we are doing that, what we are doing, and how to be serious about implementation what we are adopting. So talking about maybe this tactical point of view, how we are doing and how we are introducing sanctions. So I think that we already built like, pyramid of 15 packages, and each time we are adding something. I would call it as, boiling frog tactics a little bit, that trying, seeing what will be reaction, and then introducing some kind of new sanctions and new sanctions. Our experience and our point of view was that we would need to be much more bolder and to have more little bit maybe shock therapy tactics introducing sanctions. But as you know, it is unanimous decisions. It takes time. And now still we are not fully maybe at what we wanted to achieve at the very beginning. Then what we are adopting? I think we already made a huge progress. I fully agree with David that when you look during the last 3 years, so many sanctions were introduced in different sectors. But still, I think we still have room of maneuver to add more and to add more sanctions. And that's why we feel that 16 package will be really, really important, and we need to have ambitious package. What is maybe the most important, what we can do more, trying to achieve this objective, is to attack the money which Russia uses for war economy to continue the war in Ukraine. And we feel that energy sector is maybe the most objective target where we need to go. And we are thinking that, of course, LNG, nuclear, aluminum are the main important elements where we need to continue. Even looking since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Russian war in Ukraine, we see still that Europe paid almost 200 billion euros for fossil fuel import from Russia. So it's quite still a huge money. And I think that LNG decision will be very, very important to achieve from our side. Then also on nuclear, we still have a situation that it is quite untouchable area, and still not having very, very concrete steps from our side. And on aluminum, if our calculations are right, we are talking about 700 million euros every year what we are paying for Russia. In addition to this energy side, we also think that finances, banking sector is another area where we need to concentrate and to see how to achieve the objective. Then the third element is how we are implementing the regime of sanctions. And here we see still a lot of loopholes in the system. On circumvention, I fully agree with David that we need to talk with third countries, trying to persuade them, but at the same time, we need also to make an order in our own house. Maybe as Lithuania and with our regional partners, we started quite reinforced cooperation of our customs together with Baltic friends, and also with Finland, with Poland, also Croatia joined our initiative in a way being much more bold on our borders, checking destination of our export coming from Europe. And I think this regional cooperation works quite successfully. Just maybe from Lithuania, we stopped 19,000 times goods which having suspicious destinations, having suspicious destinations to go, and just one Lithuania with small part of external borders stopped so many times suspicious export coming from us. And I think this regional example could be some kind of model for unified European thinking about better protection of our borders, and also better protection of controlling what we are exporting, what we are importing, etc., etc. Then what I see that also sometimes we are too limited in the implementation of the tools what we have, and sometimes we are drawing some kind of lines on different criteria what we are using. Just talking, for example, as maybe very concrete example, it's individual lists and legal basis for the sanctioning. Sometimes we are so strict, not ready to enlarge the criteria for the sanctioning, and then having many battles in the courts about one another implementation. Then another maybe example, shadow fleet. Talking about that we are not maybe fully using what we can do, and not totally implementing the power what we have. Now we're sanctioning 20, 30 boats coming as a shadow fleet, but they are growing in thousands or hundreds every time. And despite our goals trying to stop they are coming more and more boats to the Baltic Sea. And for us, it's not just a problem about circumvention of sanctions, but it's national security issue. We saw also about hybrid attacks happening with this fleet. And I think that we need to be much more bolder because it has very concrete consequences, much more broader than just sanctions and circumvention of sanctions. And then maybe just as the third element, talking about the objectives of the sanctions, in addition to what we started to change Russian behavior, to help Ukraine to win the war, stop Russia economy. The third element for me is that sanctions could be also positive for us in a way that we are decreasing dependencies on non-democratic regimes. I would say that we started decoupling from Russia not 2014, but much more earlier. Maybe the first decoupling from our side was 1999, when it was big Russian crisis, economic crisis, when we realized that our economy is too dependent on Russia, and our trade is too dependent into one direction, and that's why we need to diversify, why we need to have in a way much more broader perspectives, cooperating with different countries, not being dependent on one country. Then it was energy dependence, because before 2014, Lithuania was 100% dependent on Russian gas, and we were paying the highest price for gas in Europe. And we built LNG terminal, and in a way preempted this situation when the war started, and there was a need to cut gas or electricity or petrol coming from Russia. So I think in the longer period of time, it could have also some kind of healthy consequences for our economies as well. And maybe another example which we witnessed is China and coercive measures what China introduced against Lithuania. And these coercive measures finally were also healthy for our economy as well, because of that we diversified our presence in the region. Just after the first measures, we opened 4 embassies and representations in the Indo-Pacific region, in Australia and South Korea and Singapore, economic office in Taiwan, and we compensated our losses because of Chinese coercive measures, and now we have much more healthy situation when we talk about our trade with this region. So that's maybe just a Lithuanian example, but I think it could be also some kind of inspiration to think at European level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your perspective from your country, especially looking for positive sides of this coercive behavior from China. And one quick follow-up question: are all member states really ready for this more assertive, bolder, and maybe more coordinated and centralized policies? Because it's an issue in what respect they are ready for this. Because as for example, Ambassador Sullivan suggested some level of some direction for further reform of sanctions policy in terms of some centralization.
Thank you so much. I think our country is called the hawks of sanctions. So you can imagine that we would be ready to adopt 15 package in one go in February 2022, but it didn't happen. It took some time. So, but I think that it depends on also on situation in Ukraine, and in general, of course, we need to continue, and we need to build further. It takes time, but as for me, it's not the first time in Brussels. I think that for Europe, sometimes it takes time, but finally we're achieving the results what we want to achieve.
Thank you very much. And now I would turn to you, Ambassador Sullivan, again. And my question to you as the EU sanctions envoy: you have been working at this position for already 2 years, and you are very well aware of EU policy making from inside. As we are expecting in this new geopolitical, very confrontational environment, and more different measures and tools of economic statecraft, including sanctions, and we need to somehow to coordinate the use of these tools. So my question is to you: how can you better coordinate its sanctions policy with its wider foreign policy, trade policy, development and defense and security policies, especially if some decisions are being made at the EU level, and some decisions are being taken at national levels? And also the other important question: how should sanctions policy be integrated into the EU economic security strategy?
Yeah, I mean, that's how long have we got? Look, I think sanctions policy is relatively well integrated into our broad economic and political objectives. It is an instrument of foreign policy under the treaty. That's what it's foreseen. By the way, it's foreseen in the passerelle that you could move to qualified majority, along with other aspects of foreign policy. I think some of what we've seen over the last 15 packages would be in favor of using qualified majority. I'm well aware it's not likely to happen anytime soon, but my personal view is that we should take as many decisions as possible at European level by qualified majority. But I think, you know, I said earlier that sanctions are an important tool, but we have not, and some of the conversation today seems to imply that, you know, that globalization is finished, free trade is finished. I don't think this is true when you look objectively. It's true we're going through a very difficult period. I don't disagree with that. But the fact is, we're still concluding trade agreements. We just recently signed the agreement with Mercosur. We are still negotiating other free trade agreements. Many countries around the world want to continue with the liberalization of trade flows. Now, there will be moments when you have to think about your economic security interests. As the ambassador has said, excessive dependence for certain materials or certain inputs to your production from sources which may be unreliable? I think that's a very legitimate question. We have to look at that. And I think the pandemic, was a kind of dramatic demonstration in some areas, but we have to. So I think that issue is an important one: diversification, trying to make sure that you are not vulnerable to pressure from regimes who may be unfriendly at some point for some of your critical supplies. In terms of sanctions, I mean, you have to acknowledge, what your strengths are. We collectively, the G7, don't make the economic weather, international economic weather today in the way we did before. We have to recognize that. There are many other countries that have, China is obviously a notable example, who have developed capacities that they don't necessarily need us in the way that, say, they did 10 or 15 years ago. So I understand if you look at the ways, for example, the US has used sanctions, it's mainly been on the technology. So it's been to protect their what they call their foundational technologies, or their most advanced technologies, and to avoid these falling into the hands of people who might use them economically or politically or militarily against them. So I think any use of sanctions by the EU has to also say, what exactly do we think we have that others desperately need? And let's not forget that Russia, for all its military prowess and its nuclear arsenal, is an economy the size of Italy's, and an economy heavily dependent on the export of one or two products, namely hydrocarbons. So it was the approach of sanctioning to Russia is not something that, in my view, can easily be replicated to countries which have much more sophisticated and broadly based economic structures. So we just have to think through what we want to achieve with sanctions. I absolutely agree that we need to connect the dots between the different elements of policy. I think that's what President von der Leyen, with the new commission, Mr. Šefčovič, is mandated specifically to look at the issue of economic security. We have progressively, on the trade side, equipped ourselves also with instruments of retaliation where we feel we have been unfairly and illegally subject to tariffs, for example, by trade partners who are in breach of WTO rules, or subsidies, or the trade defense mechanisms. So we need the full panoply. But I continue to believe that it is in our interest as Europeans and the values we stand for, and our economic interests, that we continue to trade, that we continue to develop, and we encourage other countries to develop and grow and prosper, because that is ultimately in our best interest. And I think we have to continue to be advocates for that. And so I would be cautious about putting forward sanctions as though this was somehow a policy objective. It's not. It's one element in the toolbox. It's particularly important against Russia now and against the aggression of Russia. It will be used for human rights. It will be used to protect some of our technologies. There will be other reasons to deploy it, but it is not, in my view, the tool of first instance. It is something that you do when you find that other more incentivizing elements have not succeeded.
Thank you very much. By the way, you mentioned incentivized measures. Maybe you are working a lot with third countries, and you mentioned several times that you are more for diplomacy than for some punitive measures. So what kind of maybe balanced approach you would suggest to said countries? Do you see that there should be some changes to the current approach, or maybe to strengthen it with other policy measures?
I think firstly, our position vis-a-vis third countries has to be one of respect. Respect for their sovereignty, respect for their national decision-making process, and respect for them to define their own best interests. We should not be the ones coming and telling them this is exactly how you need to develop. We can have views about the rule of law, we can have views about democracy, about human rights, but we have to have respect for the third countries that we engage with. But it is true that we, for example, when I raise the issue of sanctions circumvention, there's also a positive agenda. We are frequently engaged in these countries with financial assistance. Sometimes we are are engaged in discussions about visas, about development, about trade. So all I do is respectfully say to them, well, you need to see what I'm saying about sanctions in the context of our broader relationship. And we are, frankly, an attractive partner for many countries. We're one of the largest economies in the world. We're one of the most open and free trading economies. We're also one of the biggest providers of development assistance. So, you know, we have a lot that we offer, and in a genuine sense of helping countries to develop and to progress. And I don't think it's unreasonable that we respectfully ask them also to look at our security interests and our concerns, for example, about sanctions circumvention, as part of that, looking at the totality of the relationship. So, I mean, what I think we need to avoid is to appearing naive that we only come with the positive agenda and then, oh no, we can't bring the sort of negative agenda because that's an unfortunate tone to bring into the discussion. So I'm not at all afraid to bring some toughness into the dialogue with third countries, but I think it needs to be very balanced, and we need also to play to our strengths and to what we can offer in a spirit of partnership.
Thank you very much. And I would like to turn now to Nataliia Shapoval. Nataliia, are you with us?
Yes, yes.
Dear Nataliia, thank you for being with us from Kyiv. You are a member of the international expert group on sanctions, and you are working with government representatives of Ukraine and of the EU and all other Western countries. And as I know that you are working a lot with data and with evidence about the sanctions efficiency and implementation. So my question to you, from your experience, what has worked in the EU sanctions regime against Russian invasion into Ukraine so far, and what are the shortcomings? What are the learnings from? What are your major takeaways, major learnings, and what how EU sanctions regime should change more effectively and be applied to, for example, to other, in respect to other countries in a more broader context. In terms of scope, implementation, monitoring, enforcement, capacity building.
Thank you, Svitlana. Good evening, colleagues. It's really great honor to speak. Happy to see Svitlana. We worked together for many years in Kyiv, so really proud that you're leading this conversation today. Agree with everything that ambassadors has said. I think Ambassador Sullivan addressed really a lot of the issues that you asked me. I'll try to contribute a bit. So I think one of the strengths of the European sanctions specifically is in unity and in the application of this approach to Russia specifically as the economic policy. So what's really important, and I think not widely recognized, is that it's not only about like individual designations about on companies or individuals, but at the first place there are such a great streams as diversification of European countries and of EU energy from Russia. So this is an example of the economic policy that is not like typically, you know, not everything is sanctions, for example, in gas or nuclear, but there is obvious coordination and way towards becoming independent from Russia. So this coordination and unity is a great benefit. When in 2022, I think it was mid of the year, this very new phenomenon that I didn't know that existed before emerged, which is every country that became a partner of Ukraine, including in EU, set up the sanctions coordinators offices. So this, I think, increased effectiveness of sanctions very significantly. There are also some maybe things that I would call like what can be improved, and what we observe with Russia specifically. And one of these areas would be protection from propaganda. So Russia is very actively involved in all the elections in the regions, in the EU, in the US, and measures and protection from this are quite weak. It's not very typical kind of sanctions, although there are some examples. Whereas in the sanction coalitions in Europe, also the propagandists and like the companies that support this become sanctioned, but I don't think it's commensurate yet with the challenge. Secondly, it's probably in the area of critical technologies. On the one hand, there is a great achievement, which is common high priority list of technologies. So when in 2013, when I think the first sanctions against Russia were to emerge, it was very unpronounced, and in 2022 it was called dual-use goods, and there was so much ambiguity, and every package of sanctions would call would sanction dual-use items, and package after package, until this common high priority list, which is based on evidence of what Russia actually needs to produce high precision weapon, and this coordination between countries allowed to more effectively implement this policy. But on the other hand, I think as compared to US, and of course US is very privileged country in terms of policies that they can set, but for example, US has this foreign direct rule, which allows US to influence the production facilities in third countries of their technologies that are emergent in US. EU, I think, has also developing some similar steps, is still less protected from Russia, still in CNC machines technology, microchips, and everything that they need for engines. Russia is always shopping for the technology, and they not only import them through third countries, but also try to manufacture and steal in all other ways. And third thing, I think, which is being developed, and it's already in some way there. Some, you can say, secondary sanctions, but there are all kind of legal specifics about it. But in a nutshell, a lot of impact on Russia specifically in the future will come through this kind of instruments, because the more European economy becomes independent from Russia, the less of leverage can be used against them, and the more collaboration with the third countries and instruments to kind of enforce it are needed. So David O'Sullivan said that it's all, I think, going on, all the diplomacy with third countries and economic policy discussions, and the instruments itself. So in the recent packages, there were already examples of multiple examples of specific legal entities being punished for violation, but I think this instrument will be needs to be developed more. Thanks.
Thank you, Nataliia, for your reflections, and thank you for pointing out on these elements of extraterritoriality. We will cover this with a bit later with Sylvie. Now I would like to turn to Philipp. Dear Philipp, in your recent publication, "Making Sanctions an Indispensable Tool in the EU Economic Statecraft," you said that there are as the scope and number of sanctions expand, the EU is confronted with intensifying trade-offs. What are the trade-offs do different types of sanctions involve? And when it comes to security, competitiveness, sustainability, and social cohesion, how can you minimize this negative possible negative effects of sanctions and maximize maybe positive effects? Thank you.
Thank you, Svitlana. Yeah, you're right. I mean, we've all seen that sanctions are painful, and not only for the country that sanctions are leveled against, but they also have an effect on those countries that impose the sanctions, and indeed also on third countries. So yeah, I mean, I would divide them up between the domestic political trade-offs that the EU has to face, but also foreign political ones. And yeah, it's essentially a trade-off where you need to calculate how your foreign and security interests against competitiveness and prosperity on the one hand. That is something that we've seen with the Russia sanctions. Of course, the price of gas has shot up. It's not just the sanctions fault, it's also Russia who unilaterally stopped gas through Nord Stream, but it clearly has had an effect on the energy price in Europe and on the EU's competitiveness. And we also see, for example, if you use financial sanctions, that can also have an effect on, for example, financial stability, but also on the credibility of sanctioning countries when it comes to their status as financial hubs or safe investment destinations. This is not something that we've seen very much yet, but there is, of course, movements to move away from Western finance, and that's something we need to also take into account. Then there are, of course, political trade-offs. So you have the EU, of course, is made up of democratic societies. So voters can actually push back against sanctions policies because of rising costs and so on, but also because of being influenced by foreign actors. I think this is something that has been mentioned already. I think the Romanian presidential election has been a good example of how basically a TikTok candidate managed to win this election that in the end was cancelled. But this is a clear sign that social cohesion, political stability is also at stake here. And yeah, electoral pressures can then also undermine the continuity of sanctions. And when we look at the sanctions against Russia, but also more generally, I think it's also what the sanctions envoy has said. I mean, it's a long game. We need to look at the Russian economy in the long run, and it's more about undermining their productive potential. It's not going to work just overnight. So that is, of course, something that electoral volatility can undermine. And yeah, you said sustainability. I think this is also not so much the case with Russia, because of course weaning yourself off of hydrocarbons and switching to renewables, which of course should be happening quicker, but it is happening. That is actually a good thing. But if you had a scenario where sanctions would be leveled against other countries that actually play an important role in clean tech value chains, this could also change. And yeah, the question is what to do about this. And I think, first of all, I think it's relatively clear that security is a foundational goal the EU needs to has to set itself. That it's very hard to measure that against prosperity, because I mean, in the end of the day, if you don't have security, you won't be able to have a prospering economy either. So if sanctions are furthering security, I think they should be used, even if they have these trade-offs. But then you need to prepare, of course, for these trade-offs and make them less pronounced. And I think the economic security strategy has some something to say about that. I think the promote basket of economic security that talks about promoting industrial policy, but also maybe even creating areas where the EU is excelling. So that's what's being called strategic indispensability, which then would give you more of a negotiating position to make sure that you're first of all, you're not suffering from dependence, and that can then be used against you, but also it gives you a better negotiating position and sanctioning position. And then, of course, the whole de-risking and diversifying trade issue. I think the Lithuanian ambassador has talked about that already. And I think also compensation mechanisms, and that's something that you need to prepare for. It's that's something that we have mechanisms that could, in case of retaliation or sanctioning of other countries, or secondary sanctions, indeed, that the United States could, for example, introduce, as Trump has done against Iran, with respect to European companies in China. I mean, that is a possibility. So I think there needs to be a preparation against these eventualities, and the compensation mechanisms could be useful. Also, countering disinformation, I think really better enforcing the DSA is one of the means that should be pursued. And altogether, I think to remain credible and also get to public support, the politicians should be honest about this, should be honest about the costs and clearly communicate what's at stake. So on the one hand, why we need this, why our security is so important, why it's at risk, and why. But also be honest about that this is not for free, and that we need to that if we use sanctioning tools, that might be necessary, that this has a cost. And then if you look at foreign political trade-offs, I think it's been mentioned before that some of them are not really they're indirect, they're not intentional, but there have been disruptions in third countries after imposition of sanctions against Russia. Another example, in the past, even before the large-scale invasion, you had the US, sanctioning Rusal, the CEO Deripaska, who is this is basically the biggest or one of the biggest aluminum producers in the world, and the sanctioning of their CEO actually caused a major supply chain disruption and market volatility around the world. So I think what's important here is to avoid sanctions that disproportionately harm your partners, and make sure you understand actually the consequences it will have. So, and that, of course, then also requires a better supply chain intelligence and also more resources to be invested in that, to have a better picture of what actually will happen when you press one button, so to say. And I think the whole issue of sanctions evasion has been mentioned, and it's of course it will be the more sanctions the EU actually introduces, the more there will be evasion. And I think the issue of secondary sanctions has been mentioned by Nataliia already. And I think there is a case for developing these instruments. It doesn't necessarily mean that you actually have to use them, but to have a deterrent effect, it would already be good to have these instruments in place. But apart from that, I think when it comes to third countries, it's very much also what the sanctions envoy has talked about, setting positive incentives for following these sanctions and not breaching them. And I think that's trade policy, but also development policy, diplomatic recognition, visa policy, technical support, investments, things like that. I think I said most what I wanted to say. I think to finish off, I think what's very important in this really hardening context, geopolitical context, where we can also expect from former allies a much more aggressive policy. I think what's important that we need to be able to also show teeth. And I think it's not enough to just let yourself be sort of bossed around, even if it's by allies, or for that you need to have. And I think for that, it's important to have these instruments in place to think through what their consequences are, and make sure that you build up the economic security capacities to be able to actually leverage them. So that's it from my side for now.
Thank you, Philipp, and thank you again for mentioning secondary sanctions. So we can bridge to our next speaker, to Sylvie. Dear Sylvie, already several speakers mentioned about secondary sanctions. This is considered a tool how to make EU sanctions policy more efficient and more effective and bolder. What is your perspective? Should the EU use extraterritoriality in its sanctions regime? And if so, how? And what could be the implications of a more extensive use of secondary sanctions? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Svitlana. I'm delighted to be able to join you, even if it was only possible online. Sorry for that. Extraterritoriality and the main tool to apply that extraterritoriality, I mean secondary sanctions, refers in reality to the practice of applying sanctions not only to the entities within the jurisdiction of the sanctioning body, but also to third countries, entities doing business with the targeted country or entity. Unlike the US sanctions, which often include extraterritoriality clauses or measures such as secondary sanctions, the EU generally prefers to apply territorial sanctions. However, in recent years, the EU has progressively incorporated certain extraterritorial elements, particularly regarding Russia, Iran, and human rights violations. That was the example of the 11th package of sanctions, enables the EU to restrict exports to certain goods to third countries suspected of re-exporting them to Russia. But even if the EU is not useful applying extraterritoriality to sanctions regimes, we can say that many elements push to do that more and more. The broader spectrum of sanctions, for example, the growing complexity of global geopolitics and the fragmentation of globalization, particularly in the context of the confrontation between the West and the rest, and the instrumentalization of that confrontation by some powerful countries such as Russia and China. The way and possibilities to circumvent sanctions multiplied, and that have raised the question of extraterritorial measures and tools to improve sanction efficiency and compliance. Maybe I will quote two arguments to put in place and to develop extraterritoriality and secondary sanctions. The first argument is probably that it may help to strengthen the EU global influence in the world, enhancing our geopolitical clout and project power beyond our borders. This would allow us also to protect our strategic interest and exert pressure on global actors involved in activities contrary to EU value and security. The second argument may be that using extraterritorial sanction may improve the effectiveness of sanctions, helping to close loopholes where third countries' entities undermine EU sanctions by continuing to trade or finance the targeted regime. And the third argument maybe is to align with the US use of sanctions and then to facilitate the coordination with the US when we put in place and think common sanctions. But even if there is argument to develop extraterritoriality, there is also a lot of risk in that practice. The first one is probably the question of the question about legality. While extraterritorial sanction may face legal challenges in international forums and raise concerns about sovereignty violations, countries that will be affected by such sanctions could introduce blocking status. And we did that against US sanction on Iran. The second risk is probably the risk to to reduce the internal EU unity, because this is a difficult political decision, and you need a common, unanimous political will to decide such extraterritoriality. And we know that we have divergent economic and strategic interests, but also we may disagree on implementing extraterritorial sanctions. The third argument is that, and the Ambassador Sullivan explained that very well in the introduction of that conference, sanctions implies a lot of means, important means, financial, technical, humans, to impose and to implement such mechanism. In Europe, compared to the US sanction management is centralized at the OFAC, and US sanctions are most of the time broader than EU one, imposing restrictive measures. Then it facilitates sanction extraterritoriality. In Europe, we have a spread of sanctions between 27 member states, with many departments and services different in each country, and implicated in that implementation of sanctions, that it may be really difficult to ensure the implementation of that extraterritoriality, such as we have seen how difficult it is to ensure the effectiveness of sanctions in Europe and sanctions regime in Europe. Moreover, extraterritoriality, and we can see that with the US, is also connected to the perception you have about your power and the will you have to use that power to deter, constrain, and punish. I'm not totally sure that it is in the EU mindset, and I'm not sure that we have the legal and judicial institution to do it. And finally, another risk is that the risk of retaliation, economic retaliation, and diplomatic backlash against that sanction. Remember that we had often ourselves criticized the abusive use of the US extraterritoriality of sanctions while taking measure against. One of the most example, and I think it was Philipp that talked about that, was the example of when the President Trump, just after leaving the JCPOA, the agreement about the Iranian nuclear program, threatened to sanction EU companies if they continue to do business with Iran. And I think explaining the interest we may have to put in place extraterritoriality and the risk it presents, I underline also how could we implement such sanctions? It is an issue of legal framework and harmonization. It is also an issue to think and implement secondary sanctions. And remember, in the US, the secondary sanctions are decided by the US president. He could do that without any vote from the Congress, then that's really agile and easy to put in place. I'm not sure we have the possibility to do that in Europe. Thinking about extraterritoriality sanction will imply more measure and more means to monitor and enforce that sanctions, and will imply also diplomatic engagement and coordination. Then that may be a way to improve our sanctions regimes, but at the same time we have to take into account the difficulties it will represent to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insights and reflections. And I would like also to continue with this issue of secondary sanctions, and maybe we'll ask you and also other speakers, if I may, about what would be the EU vision and on the possible response in case Trump administration would apply secondary sanctions towards EU companies in China. If you have some suggestions, maybe you already heard some arguments about these things.
I'm not sure to have a precise answer on that question, because secondary sanction against entities doing business in China seems to be really difficult, and that's much more political and diplomatic issue, because we have strong links with China. Even if we try to de-risk or decouple our relationship with that country, it is still an important partner, and that shows the limit of secondary sanctions. Because if you are always, when you talk about secondary sanction, you always take the risk to be accused of double standard measure, and I think we will have much more difficulties to implement secondary sanctions concerning China than to do it with Kazakhstan or other countries connected to Russia. Clearly, I don't know if I answered the question, but that's an excellent example to show the interest and in the same time the limit of that secondary sanctions.
Thank you very much. And Philipp wants to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think using secondary sanctions by the EU towards China, of course, is something that is, not something we should try anytime soon, or it's something that we will hope to have to do anytime soon. But I think the question was also is what happens if Trump, sanctions European companies that do business with China, even if that's just in some more critical areas. I mean, we've seen ASML being sort of bent of doing business with China, but if this is being extended by Trump, and if it could actually then hit the European economic interests more harshly, then I think it's also necessary to react to that. And I think it's worth looking back to what happened after Trump ended the nuclear deal, and European companies, Total, for example, was one of the cases fell under these extraterritorial sanctions or secondary sanctions. And this, the EU did develop some instruments. I think it was mentioned the blocking regulation, where companies are not allowed to follow these sanctions by the EU, otherwise they get punished. But I think the idea here would really be to also help to compensate against this. And on the other hand, I think it's important for the EU to develop alternative instruments. So, for example, in the case of Iran, the EU developed it was France, Germany, UK, I think, with a foreign higher representative. They introduced this Instex, an alternative financial infrastructure to SWIFT, which would then allow European transactions be less vulnerable to US sanctions. I think something like that should be developed again. I think there was closed down actually in 2023. I think there should be rather a movement in the other direction to build alternatives there, and to make sure that if European companies do get sanctioned again by the US, that there is a way to deal with that. And I think more generally, I think also to support the international role of the euro is very important, to create safe assets, to support capital markets union, more to introduce a capable digital euro. These are all ways to strengthen the euro, and of course we also have the anti-coercion instrument, and I think it does allow for some leverage there as well, for some whether it's denying market access or terrorist export controls and so on. But yeah, and for example, a European export bank could be an idea to help companies from Europe continue business that if they fall under these sanctions. So I think or also an agency that monitors that, and sort of a one-stop shop that also was mentioned by David O'Sullivan that could also cover this. I think there are definitely ways to prepare the EU better for such an eventuality.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned about compensation to EU companies. What do you mean? It's creating a fund, or what kind of compensation?
I mean, you could do create some sort of resilience fund or resilience mechanism that could be, part of a larger sort of crisis fund that the EU develops, ideally permanently, but otherwise you could also do it through cohesion policy. I mean, that has been leveraged, for example, during the COVID crisis, relatively well to help companies that were affected by COVID. I mean, why shouldn't that be possible also for companies that fall under such, fall under sanctions?
Thank you very much for your arguments, and I think that it's already almost time for our next Q&A session. Thank you very much for our speakers for discussion, and if you want to comment maybe with what you have heard from other speakers, you are welcome. If not, we will take questions, better questions. Okay. So please, dear guests and the audience, go.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the speakers for the excellent discussion. My name is Balaji Meshi. I'm Communications Manager at RUSI Europe, the Royal United Services Institute. And my question would be about the upcoming transposition of the criminalization directive of sanctions evasion, which is going to come into effect this spring. How do you feel? What are your views? How is that going to change the landscape on enforcement that we currently have in the EU? And what do you think about also the idea of making some of the decisions in member countries about penalties that are companies that are being fined for sanctions circumvention to be made more public, also to act as a deterrent within the EU? This is something that, for example, is very much of a practice in the US, but it's not so much a case in the EU. So how do you see whether that could help also when it comes to enforcement within the EU of sanctions? Thank you.
Are there any other questions, please?
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Anastasia. I'm the trainee at the European Parliament. And I've got a question on these objectives tools nexus that we mentioned throughout the discussion. And I'm just wondering, what are the assumptions underpinning the objectives? I do appreciate that sanctions, and especially sanctions practitioners and specialists, they do not have the scope of influence that might really affect those objectives that determine sanction as a key tool to achieve something. But is there something that is completely wrong about understanding what Russian imperialism is, what is not, that might really affect those objectives that are not just being achieved because the underpinning nature of them just do not allow the sanctions to do so? Thank you.
I think we can take replies, and then maybe we'll have another round of questions.
I mean, I could come in quickly on the naming and shaming idea. I think that's something we should do more, to sort of to name and shame those companies that breach sanctions. That's something within the EU, but also internationally. I think that's a practice that should be adopted more by member states, by the EU as well. The EU, as you said, the United States is doing this. I think the reputational cost is something that is it can be very substantial, and it can have a deterrent effect. So I think this should be used. I can't say much about the criminalization directive, but maybe my co-panelists can tell you more on that.
No, I mean, sanction circumvention is a crime. It's a European crime under the treaty. It is true that we had very diverse practices across member states as to the penalties for that crime. And the criminal harmonization directive, which is being transposed now by member states, was an effort to introduce some element of common penalties. It's not a perfect harmonization, but it's an approximation. So I think it will reinforce the seriousness with which this issue is taken, because in some member states the penalties were very, very mild. So now they're much more aligned. And I also agree that the naming and shaming should be given more publicity. I mean, I don't actually think myself that the biggest problem lies in European citizens actively working to circumvent sanctions. The problem is more, the people on whom you've imposed the sanctions orchestrating a procurement network. And very often the European companies who are caught up unwittingly. So frankly, they're not. I think that the number of cases where you will find deliberate circumvention of sanctions by European companies, for example, is going to be relatively small. That is not to say that European companies are not caught up in schemes to circumvent sanctions and may unwittingly be a party to that. So it's very much about the information you give companies, the sharing of bad actors in third countries, the listing of interlocutors and companies in third countries who are potentially part of a procurement network. So I mean, it's the totality of working across the whole range. But for industry, it really is about maximizing the information which they can have at their disposal to know that how they need to systematically avoid getting caught up in sanction circumvention, even unwittingly. And I think that has been the case for financial institutions, for example, very much already because of the reputational risk. It was the case for bigger companies where we have a problem, I think, with the Russia sanctions. As I said earlier, it reaches so deeply into the fabric of our economic and commercial life that many smaller companies were potentially at risk, and they simply weren't equipped. They had never had to deal with this before. One point I would just like to make, I mean, I don't want to get involved in the whole extraterritoriality debate. I mean, I think you need to make a distinction between extraterritorial effect and secondary sanctions. European sanctions do have extraterritorial effect, but the issue really that we have with the Americans is about the secondary sanctions, where you sanction a company not on your territory for breach of your sanctions, even though they are perfectly in respect of their own legal order, which was famously PNB, Paribas Bank, which got badly stung over the Iran sanctions. I think that there is not great appetite amongst our member states to go down that road as a matter of principle. I spent a lot of my life fighting American extraterritoriality. I must admit, I now have a bit more sympathy for it when I'm dealing with Russia. But I think the thing you really need to be aware of is the power of the dollar in that. I mean, Philipp mentioned it. That is what gives the American secondary sanctions real bite. And the euro, even though it's the world's second reserve currency, it's still only the second and way behind the dollar. So the impact of European secondary sanctions would be extremely limited by the extent of the currency, because the great strength from the American perspective is the preeminent role of the dollar. So I think we also have to be realistic that even if we went down that road, we would not have anything like the same impact that the Americans are able to have with their secondary sanctions.
Thank you. Maybe just to add, firstly, I think that we should be clear that as Europe, we should have tools how to implement our sanctions regime. And in this sense, I think this regime of sanctions on Russia has this positive impact that we are learning by doing and seeing on the loopholes what we have in our system and adjusting. And this example of transposition of harmonization of penalties, I think it's a very right approach. We need to do that. We need to look to the system, what is functioning, what is not functioning, and to adjust. And that will be something helpful for us. Secondly, I fully agree on communication and on maybe having stronger emphasis on naming and shaming exercise. I know in my country, in Lithuania, we have zero tolerance on companies or individuals who are trying to circumvent sanctions. It's everywhere in the press. There's big risk of for companies to be involved somewhere because there's a huge public pressure for these companies. And I think publicity, this public element helps a lot for this for the goal what we want to achieve. And then I also agree that we need also to be clear with our system, because with each package we're adopting also a lot of exemptions, derogations, and then sometimes for the companies it's very difficult to understand what they need to do, how they need to do, and sometimes maybe there are some circumventions that are not happening from the intentions, but still they don't know maybe exactly how to interpret, and there's sometimes to have unified interpretation of execution of sanctions is still lagging behind. So that's why we feel that even on after 3 years of war in Russia's war in Ukraine, we should already think about how to limit these exemptions, because we already had time to adjust, to adapt, and that's why we need to move from exemptions more to derogations, because derogations gives much more possibilities to control than to have very broad exemptions in our system. Just maybe one additional element what we haven't touched, but also which is important when we talk about implementation of sanctions, is also to have alignment of sanctions to Russia also with Belarus. And we are the ones who are maybe talking a lot about that, because also we see a loophole here. If we are sanctioning Russia and still keeping possibilities to do trade with Belarus, there's very easy way how we creating a loophole in our understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have one more question online, and we will be concluding our session. So the question is, how do other geo-economic tools the EU has, like anti-coercion instrument, international procurement instrument, inbound and outbound investment screening, complement sanctions? I think we already touched upon this, but maybe one.
Maybe this time I can start into another direction. Firstly, on anti-coercive measures, I think what we created here with a mechanism which was maybe inspired a little bit with our experience with China, is already having very concrete consequences, because I think it created a legal basis for Europe to act, to have a tool, to have possibility to react to such kind of situations, and I think that that already paid very concrete results in also in our relations with China. Then on investment screening, I think also we are a little bit maybe sometimes too late, too slow on that. In Lithuania, for example, we introduced a national scheme of investment screening many years ago, and this mechanism is functioning very well. Of course, we introduced this mechanism based on our risks coming from Russia, but we use this instrument also against Chinese investments in our critical infrastructure, and that's why now in a way we don't have many big Chinese investments, and we saved our critical infrastructure and our railroads and also our port from the risks which could be happening in the next years to come. So that's, I think, it's also important element. Then sometimes we talk about sanctions, but also we have tools like tariffs, which could be used much more in a way, because that's way how we can be more offensive, just not always to react, but also to have some kind of offensive element here. And maybe this example of fertilizers is also in a way quite a good example, because because of Russian fertilizers, our own sector of fertilizers is dying. Lithuania is quite an important producer of fertilizers, and our company is facing a huge pressure because Russia uses cheap energy in order to produce fertilizers, and they are selling in our countries this cheap fertilizers, and it's not exactly the same level playing field when we talk about environment, about different kind of standards what we are putting here in Europe. And for me, it is question of also our dependencies. You know, we are creating new dependency here, and also it is question about food security. It's really a very, very important question when we talk about Europe. So that's why we need to be much more offensive sometimes, also to take decisions based on our own interest, and how to avoid situations when we see sometimes that now we're becoming dependent on lithium and other examples which are not so positive. We need to think about Europe, about autonomy, economic autonomy, and to build our decisions also on this element.
Yeah, maybe I come in on that as well. I think these instruments that you've mentioned, I think they are very much complementary to sanctions, but they essentially defensive, right? So I mean, anti-coercion is great. Instrument is great if you are actually, you know, facing sanctions or unfair trade conditions. But also, yeah, international procurement, inbound, outbound investment, screening, and so on. I think these are all instruments for more economic security, to making the European Union's economy more resilient. But I think it's not enough. We also need to develop more offensive instruments, at least to have a deterrent potential that can be used.
David, no. Okay, thank you very much. I think that we had a consensus about the necessity for more offensive measures, and no, and with some considerations from Ambassador O'Sullivan. And I would like to provide the floor to Philipp just to conclude our session. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Svitlana, and thanks very much also to the panelists and to everyone who attended this event online and offline. Yeah, I just wanted to mention again, we're having we started a project on the use of sanctions policy by the European Union that's taking this from a sort of more global perspective, not just Russia, but looking at the geopolitical situation and how it unfolds, and how the EU can use sanctions more effectively as a tool of economic statecraft that we see is being used more around the world. So we will have more events on that, and roundtables and publications. So yeah, look out for that. And with that, we conclude the session. Thank you very much again.